Today, we're really getting into a pivotal and, frankly, incredibly tough moment in history. The Partition of India.
Yeah, and we're doing that by looking closely at some specific source material, excerpts from Urvashi Butalia's The Other Side of Silence.
Exactly. And the goal isn't just to recount the usual political history. We want to ask, what was happening beneath that? What were the human stories, the experiences that often get lost in the big narratives?
What was the real human cost? That's the core question.
That's our mission today, to unpack those personal, often hidden experiences using the voices and insights from this material. Okay, let's dive in.
So when we usually talk about partition, the history lessons, they tend to focus on the political side of things, don't they?
Right. You hear about the Congress and the Muslim League, the growing divide, the big names Jinnah, Gandhi, Nehru, Patel. It's all about the lead up to August 1947 and the immediate aftermath.
The transfer of power, the drawing of borders. But the material we're looking at argues pretty strongly that this perspective, while important, it kind of sidelines the experiences of the millions, literally millions, of ordinary people caught up in it.
Like looking at a storm just by tracking the weather fronts, not the damage on the ground.
Precisely. The argument here is that the true history, or maybe a fuller history, lies in what the author calls the human dimensions.
Okay. What does that encompass?
Well, it's the messy stuff, really. It's about loss, obviously, immense loss, but also sometimes unexpected moments of sharing or connection. It's about friendships breaking apart into, bitter enmity, but also other bonds somehow surviving against all odds. It's about grief, deep grief, but also joy found in small moments, painful regret over things done or not done, nostalgia, a powerful longing for lost homes, lost friends, and just sheer determination, the will to rebuild a life from ruins.
Things that are really hard to quantify or put in a standard historical account.
Exactly. They're difficult to capture factually in the way historians often like, but, and this is key, these experiences, these feelings, they live on. They live on vividly in people's memories, both individual and collective.
So the approach is to turn to memory itself.
Yes, to see memory as the underside of history, not as a flawed substitute for facts, but as a crucial way of knowing the event, understanding how it was lived and felt.
But memory, it's subjective, isn't it? It can change over time, be influenced by things. How reliable is it as a historical source?
That's a really important point, and the author addresses it head on. She's very clear that memory is not ever pure or unmediated. It absolutely isn't.
Okay.
So much depends on context, like who is doing the remembering? Is it someone who was a child then or an adult? When are they remembering? Right after or 50 years later? Who are they talking to? A family member? An outsider? All these things shape the memory.
So it's an interpretation, really.
Yeah.
Even the act of remembering.
It is. But the argument is that the way people choose to remember, what they emphasize, what they perhaps leave out, is just as significant as trying to pin down objective facts. Because historical facts themselves are interpretations too, right? Selected and presented by someone.
That's true. So understanding the remembering process itself tells us something crucial.
Yes. It tells us how people made sense of or failed to make sense of unimaginable events.
So when the author started talking to people, trying to access these memories, what kind of reception did she get? Were people eager to share?
Actually, quite the opposite sometimes. A very common initial reaction was reluctance. People asking, what is the use of remembering? Memories we've put behind us. Why dig it all up again?
I mean, that makes sense. If you've survived something that horrific, maybe you just want to move on.
Absolutely. And the events were horrific, far beyond what the sanitized statistics, X million displaced, Y thousand killed can convey. But the source suggests this reluctance might go even deeper than just the pain.
Deeper how?
The author proposes that it might also be connected to people's own potential complicity in what happened.
Complicity? You mean their own role in the violence?
Yeah. This is a really challenging idea explored in the source. It suggests that during partition, there weren't neat categories of good people and bad people. It argues that virtually every family had a history of being both victims and aggressors.
Wow. Victims and aggressors. Yeah. In the same family.
That's the argument. People suffered terrible violence, but in the chaos and breakdown of society, many also participated in violence or maybe stood by while it happened. This difficult duality, holding the memory of being victimized alongside the memory, perhaps buried, of being an aggressor, Well, that could explain a very deep-seated reluctance to talk about it publicly.
It adds a whole layer of maybe shame or guilt on top of the trauma.
Exactly. Maybe within the family you can talk about parts of it, maybe suppress the ugly parts, as the source puts it, but sharing it with the world, putting it on record, that forces a confrontation with those difficult truths.
Which makes accessing these stories even more important, but also more fraught.
Definitely. It shows why we need these personal histories to get a fuller picture, warts and all. It wasn't just politics, it was a society tearing itself apart.
And that tearing apart led to one of the most staggering migrations in history. Let's talk about that experience of displacement.
The sheer scale is almost incomprehensible. It was one of the largest, fastest mass migrations ever recorded. We're talking about 12 million people forced to move.
12 million.
And over 10 million of those just across the new western border dividing Punjab. And this wasn't orderly. People were fleeing violence or being driven out by it. The journey itself was often marked by, well, slaughter, disease outbreaks in makeshift camps, horrific sexual violence, families torn apart, homes and livelihoods destroyed, just utter chaos.
The numbers are numbing, but the source brings it down to individual lives, right? Through specific stories.
Yes, and these stories show the deep, lasting impact. Take Rashpal's story. He'd moved to the U.S. years after partition, built a life, married, had kids, thought that part of his history was completely behind him.
Okay.
Then, decades later, out of the blue, he gets a phone call from Gurdaspur, back in Punjab.
Pulling the past right back.
Instantly. The call was to tell him his father had died and left him property. But this threw him into total confusion, anger, upset. Who was this father? It brought back fragmented childhood memories, seemed connected to this depression he'd always struggled with. He actually sought help to trace this history, to understand who this unknown father was. It just shows how partition's legacy could lie dormant for years and then suddenly erupt.
Decades later, on the other side of the world, trauma doesn't follow a timetable.
Not at all. And then there's the story of Harbhajan, which is just heartbreaking in terms of fractured families.
What happened to her?
In the early 60s, communication between India and Pakistan eased slightly. She found out her parents were alive in India. Her husband, incredibly, agreed to take her across the border to visit them.
Must have been such a hopeful journey.
Immense hope. And her parents were thrilled to see her. But then came the devastating part. They refused to let her go back to Pakistan.
They wouldn't let her leave.
No. They gave her this awful choice.
Yeah.
Stay in India with them, and she could keep her children. But her husband had to go back alone.
Choose between her parents and her husband and children. That's cruel.
An impossible position created by the border. Her husband couldn't leave the kids, so he went back to Pakistan with their 5 children. He eventually remarried, and his second wife raised Harbhajan's children.
And her mom.
Her parents married her off to a Sikh widower in India, Gurcharan, who needed someone to care for his young son. So she raised this boy as her own.
A whole different life.
A completely different life. Years later, that son became a professor, moved to the U.S., and brought Harbhaj, the woman he knew as his mother, to live with him. It was only then, through conversations much later in her life, that he pieced together the whole hidden story. Her first marriage, her 5 other children back in Pakistan, the forced separation, all of it buried for decades.
Just layers and layers of silence and sacrifice. It's staggering.
It really shows the profound, often invisible ways partition continued to shape lives long after 1947.
The author also shares her own family's connection through her uncle, Ranama.
Yes, this is a very personal thread. Ranamama was her mother's brother. He stayed behind in the family home in Lahore when the rest of the family left for India.
He stayed in Lahore. How?
He converted to Islam and married a Muslim woman. His explanation to the family initially was pragmatic. It was about survival, the only way he could keep the home. He also mentioned wanting to spare his sister, the author's mother, the burden of their elderly mother, who also stayed with him.
A practical explanation, maybe a bit detached.
The author found it hard to accept fully, but later, Ranamama confided in her the deeper truth. Immense regret, a feeling of profound unease. He felt alienated, accepted by neither his new community nor truly belonging in his old home. He put it so painfully. Every brick in this house seems to curse me. I rejected what was mine, and I have not been accepted by the faith I adopted.
So he was physically home, but emotionally homeless.
Exactly. And the cost to the family was enormous. 40 years of separation from Ranama and the grandmother. Communication just stopped. Suspicion, surveillance, letters being opened. Rumors flew about the grandmother's death, but nothing confirmed.
40 years.
The initial loss curdled into bitterness, then a sort of indifference, especially for the author's generation. They only found out the grandmother had actually lived until 1956, 9 years after Partition, when the author finally visited Lahore in 1987. She had died while most of her children were living just across the border in Delhi, unaware. The author writes, quite devastatingly, "Some things are difficult to forgive."
And the reunion itself after 41 years.
It was tense, emotional. The author describes being nervous going to the house, but Ranima's immediate reaction was to pull her in, saying, "Betty, daughter, this is your home. You must come home, and you must stay here." It was this powerful, instant reclaiming of the family bond, overriding everything.
The connection was still there.
Deeply. Tears were shed. But the complexity remained. Even living in Lahore, Rana Mama's sense of watan, that deep Punjabi word for homeland, belonging. Longing was for India, a place he'd barely visited.
His heart was across the border.
Yeah. He watched Indian news, Indian soaps, apparently secretly cheered for India in cricket matches. It's such a vivid illustration of the fractured identities Partition created, where political borders couldn't contain personal belonging.
That detail about the cricket, it really paints a picture. The source also includes a letter, doesn't it, about dignity?
Yes, a really moving piece. It's a letter written to someone who helped a displaced person recover vital documents, things like house deeds, land records, insurance papers, bank books, basically the proof of their former life. The letter is full of immense gratitude for this help.
But there was something else.
Yes, alongside the thanks, there was this heartfelt complaint. The helper had enclosed a 1 rupee note with a form, presumably to cover postage or a fee, but the person who received it felt deeply hurt, seeing it as an implication that they were so poor, so lowly, they couldn't even afford 1 rupee.
So an act of kindness was felt as an insult to their dignity.
Exactly. The writer insists on being allowed to repay the kindness somehow, even offering to serve the helper as their qadim, their dependent or servant. It just powerfully shows how crucial dignity, reciprocity, the ability to give back, even in small ways, was for people who had lost almost everything. Maintaining self-worth was vital.
These stories make the human cost incredibly real. Now let's focus on a group often called the forgotten victims women and the specific widespread violence they faced.
This is a major and deeply disturbing focus of the source material. The scale of sexual violence during Partition was horrific. We're talking estimates of around 75,000 women abducted and raped, and it's a history that's been largely surrounded by silence.
75,000. Just staggering. How did the new governments of India and Pakistan deal with this?
Well, initially they were completely overwhelmed by the chaos, but they did eventually acknowledge the issue of abducted women. As early as September 1947, the prime ministers agreed that forced conversions and forced marriages wouldn't be recognized. And crucially, they agreed that abducted women must be restored to their families.
An official policy of recovery, then?
Yes. It was formalized in treaties and laws like the Inter-Dominion Treaty and the Abducted Persons Recovery and Restoration Act. Both governments agreed to set up the systems needed to recover these women from across the new border.
But this recovery process itself, it wasn't simple, was it? It threw up its own problems.
Huge problems. One really striking paradox the source points out involves India's identity. India was officially secular, right, not defined by religion, yet this Recovery Act defined women primarily by their religious identity.
How so?
For the state's purposes, the proper home for Hindu and Sikh women was deemed to be India, and for Muslim women, Pakistan. It didn't matter where they might have built new lives, or had children, or even if they wanted to stay. Their destination was decided by their original religion.
So men had a choice of nation, theoretically, but abducted women didn't. Their identity was assigned by the state based on religion.
That's essentially what happened. Their agency was often completely overridden, and even defining who counted as abducted was complex. They set an arbitrary date, March 1st, 1947. But how do you determine if someone went willingly, maybe escaping something else, versus being forcibly taken? The state basically set arbitrary rules because it was simpler than dealing with individual complexities.
And the actual recovery work on the ground must have been incredibly difficult.
Immensely difficult. One major issue was resistance from the women themselves. Many didn't want to leave, especially if they had children born after the abduction. They faced being forcibly separated from those children.
And the source mentions something even more disturbing: complicity from authorities.
Yes, this is truly shocking. The Indian government was apparently reluctant to give the police sole responsibility for rescues because police officers themselves were sometimes involved in the abductions.
The rescuers were sometimes the perpetrator.
The source gives examples. A Tahsildar, a local official, kept an abducted woman hidden for months while publicly pretending to search for her. 2 police sub-inspectors sent to recover a woman raped her instead. It shows a complete breakdown of trust and authority.
Unbelievable. Amidst this horror, there's the story of Damayanti Sahgal.
Yes, her personal account as a social worker involved later is harrowing. She initially survived the violence after being abandoned, found by police sick and traumatized on a bus. There's this small detail of a young man giving her his seat, helping her despite her state, a tiny moment of kindness in the chaos.
A flicker of humanity. And she went on to work in the recovery effort in Pakistan.
She did, risking her own safety. Her account includes the very difficult case of Satya, a Hindu woman abducted, living with a Muslim man, Buddha Singh. They had 2 daughters, and the source says they actually came to love each other.
Love found in such terrible circumstances.
Yeah. But Satya was traced, possibly because Buddha Singh's relatives feared she'd inherit property. She was forced to leave him, despite the whole village turning out to watch her go.
Did Buddha Singh accept this?
No, he was determined. He got a visa, went to Pakistan to find her. By a twist of fate, failing to report his arrival, he ended up before a magistrate and explained his situation. The magistrate ordered Satya be brought to court.
A chance for reunion.
But it was devastating. In court, surrounded by her relatives, Satya rejected him. She offered him 1 child but said, "I am a married woman. Now I have nothing to do with this man." You can only imagine the pressure she was under.
And Damayanti witnessed this.
She was there, trying to get Satya recovered under the official agreement. She recounts arguing with officials, Pathans claiming Satya was Muslim. She even telegraphed a minister, threatening to quit over the fraud.
She really fought for her.
She did. The minister arranged to meet Satya at a railway station. Huge crowd. Damayanti felt alone, overwhelmed. Satya was brought in handcuffs and apparently directed venom at Damayanti, blaming her for the situation.
And what happened to Satya in the end?
Damayanti's account doesn't say. Her fate after being taken away from the station is unknown from this source. It just highlights the impossible bind these women were in.
Damayanti also heard other deeply disturbing things, didn't she?
Yes. A chilling story about a Nawab, a local ruler who would have abducted girls paraded before him like objects. He'd pick the young, pretty ones for his own household, his zenana, and give the others away, just treating them like property.
That's horrifying objectification.
And another huge, heartbreaking issue was the children born from these abductions or mixed relationships. Families in India, especially Hindu and Sikh families, were often deeply reluctant to accept a woman back if she came with such a child.
Why? Because of ideas about purity.
Exactly. The child was seen as a constant reminder of the violation or perhaps the uncomfortable fact of the relationship itself. It challenged notions of lineage and purity. Muslim families were apparently sometimes more accepting.
So women faced another impossible choice about their own children.
Yes, often it was. Keep your child and live in a state home, an ashram, possibly forever,
Yeah.
or give up your child to an orphanage and then maybe your family would take you back.
Give up your child.
And many women were pregnant when recovered. The source mentions the state actually financed mass abortions using the term safaya, meaning cleaning out. Clinics performed these procedures. Women who gave birth often had to hand the babies over to state homes. They might visit them later, facing that agony of separation. These children, the source notes, had no future if their mixed parentage was known.
The state sanctioning mass abortions. That's hard to comprehend.
It is, and the fate of these children was even debated in India's Constituent Assembly. One argument, framed as humanitarian, was to keep children born in India there, citing the father's legal rights, but also, chillingly, the fear they might be murdered as illegitimate if taken to Pakistan.
So illegitimacy and national identity trumped the child's bond with their mother.
It seems that way. The state, society, families, they often prioritized restoring the woman to her community, which meant erasing the evidence of her time away, the child. It fundamentally challenged ideas about motherhood, purity, women's sexuality. Separating mother and child allowed the woman to be reinstated and the liaison hidden.
How long did this recovery operation go on for?
9 years. It officially ended in 1957. Around 30,000 women were recovered in total, more Muslim women from India than Hindu Sikh women from Pakistan. The biggest hurdle remained the women's reluctance to leave children. Eventually, special homes were set up for those unwilling to return, giving them a sort of limbo status.
So the focus is often on violence between communities. But the source talks about violence within communities, too, tied to honor.
Yes, this is another deeply hidden, uncomfortable part of the history. Violence by, say, Hindu and Sikh men against Hindu and Sikh women is often silenced, unlike the violence from the other. It contradicts the narrative of communities sticking together protectively.
And this includes stories of mass suicides or women being killed by their own families.
Tragically, yes. These became widespread, and in some narratives, particularly within the Sikh community, these deaths are framed as martyrdom acts necessary to save the community's honor from being violated through rape, abduction, or conversion by the other. The idea was death over dishonor.
There's a specific horrific account from Thoa village.
It's extremely disturbing, from March 1947 in Rawalpindi. In one large house, Sardar Gulab Singh's Haveli, 26 girls were specifically set aside to be killed by their male relatives, fathers, uncles, brothers.
Killed by their own families to save them.
Yes. The account details fathers killing daughters after praying together. A sister calmly preparing for death by her father's hand. The sound of the kirpans. 25 girls killed that way. Another pregnant girl, wounded, asked for opium and prayed before being shot by her cousin because she knew she wouldn't survive. It's described as her taking death in her control.
And this was then portrayed as heroic, as martyrdom.
Yes. The men who did the killing or saw women jump into wells were seen as shaheeds, martyrs, preserving Sikh identity, Sikhi. The women are also called martyrs, who willingly sacrificed themselves. This narrative, the source says, is sometimes retold in gurudwaras even today, urging women to be prepared to do the same.
It's compared to Johar, the Rajput practice.
It is, and there's often an implication that women who survived were somehow lesser than those who died. The underlying patriarchal logic is clear. Community honor resides in women's bodies, and men must protect that honor, even by killing the women if capture seems imminent.
Which raises profound questions about consent versus coercion.
Absolutely. Were these women truly willing victims? Or were they coerced by immense pressure, fear, and patriarchal norms? Was it a patriarchal consensus, as the source asks? And why isn't this internal violence counted as partition violence? Instead, it's often sanitized, presented as valorous acts, shorn of the violence, and indeed coercion.
It seems like a way to avoid confronting the full horror, maybe, by reframing it.
Perhaps. But it silences the reality of the violence and the women's potentially terrifying final moments.
Let's turn to another group often overlooked, children. They were obviously deeply affected.
Absolutely central to it, yet their specific histories are hard to access, partly because, there's an assumption they couldn't really understand or articulate what was happening.
The source mentions Murad, who was a child then.
Yes, his memories, recounted as an adult Tonga driver in Lahore, give some insight. His account is described as somewhat terse and distant. Maybe the adult trying to make sense of childhood trauma, maybe downplaying the terror, like describing hiding during killings as just past the time.
What did he go through?
Terrible things. Hiding in fields after his uncle was killed, reaching a squalid camp, seeing more killings, taking a military train, being suspicious of poisoned drinks that kill others, walking alone to the border. He talks about feeling utterly uprooted, falling from a well to an abyss.
That phrase is powerful. From a well to an abyss.
He didn't understand the politics, just that big people knew, and he had to go to Pakistan, a place he'd never seen. For him, his birthplace was Lahore. He also had this memory, or maybe interpretation, that the English deliberately kept Muslims weak, leading to the violence.
Just thrown into chaos, told to belong somewhere new. How did the state deal with these displaced kids?
They did set up facilities, schools, orphanages, adoption systems, but generally, the source suggests they were seen as liabilities, burdens on the new state.
And there's that story of the doctor who grew up in an ashram but denied it.
Yes, another example of trauma and stigma leading to erasure. This successful doctor hid her past in a home for displaced children. She even looked down on other children there, especially those born to abducted women, calling them tainted, impure.
Impure? That's incredibly harsh, reflecting the societal view.
It really does. Her denial also seems linked to class wanting to be seen as self-made, wiping away the state support she received. It shows how the specific shame attached to parts of the partition experience could lead people to bury their own histories.
What was the fate of many children in state care?
Many just remained in institutions, moved around, their family connections lost, but parents searched desperately. Sometimes, amazingly, reunions happened years later through pure chance and community networks.
Like Dharam Kaur finding her daughter Mohinder.
Yes, that's an incredible story. Dharam Kaur lost her daughter Mohinder in the violence. Mohinder was found, raised in an orphanage as Anwar Siddiqa by a kind nurse. Decades later, Siddiqa was on a bus with her own young daughter. Her daughter instinctively touched a Sikh man nearby and called him Mammu uncle. This triggered Siddiqa to tell the man her story. He, having recently found his own lost sister through community networks, promised to help. And incredibly, through word of mouth, he located Siddiqa's parents, the Ramkar, and her husband.
An almost unbelievable reunion, thanks to community memory.
A rare happy ending, relatively speaking, but many weren't so lucky. Think of Kamaruddin Ahmed searching for his daughter abducted in Sheikhupura by someone from their own village, it turns out. He went to India multiple times looking for her. He was arrested as a spy and jailed for 3 years.
A spy? While searching for his child? The injustice is immense.
Yes. And after his release, neither government would help him find her. His search ended when the official recovery program stopped in 1957. Heartbreaking.
And that detail about abductors often being known people.
Yes, a list from Sheikhupura showed abductors and rapists were often people from the same village, people who were known to the families. It wasn't just anonymous mobs.
The source also mentions a state scheme later on to deal with displaced students. It sounds a bit off.
Yeah, a 1954 scheme aimed to restore the morale of displaced students, but it framed their trauma, everything they'd seen and suffered, as simple indiscipline. The solution proposed was training in moral and spiritual values, Indian culture, patriotism.
Calling trauma indiscipline and offering patriotism as a cure seems wildly inappropriate.
It really does. It sounds more like trying to mold citizens than addressing deep psychological wounds.
This all really underscores how complex partition was and how many experiences have been pushed to the margins, like caste.
Absolutely. The standard narrative is so focused on Hindu, Muslim, Sikh dynamics. But the source highlights a key moment for the author, interviewing Maya Rani, who said point blank, "We're not Hindus or Muslims, we're Harijans," using the term for Dalits.
A moment of clarity.
A huge one, realizing how much partition history is differentiated by caste, class, region, gender, etc., and how upper caste Hindu experience is often treated as the norm, the unmarked one, while everyone else is other.
So we need to analyze partition through a caste lens, too.
The source argues strongly for it. Different experiences of violence, different abilities to tell stories, different rehabilitation experiences. It cites Ambedkar's work on partition as crucial but often ignored. Dalit activism is now pushing for this.
And Maya Rani's own story of looting houses.
Also,
how does caste change how we see that?
well, while she was scared, she also felt a degree of safety because of her Harijana identity. Hindus, Christians, no one can take us away, she thought. It shows how different groups assessed risk and navigated the chaos based on their social position.
She also felt partition was for the big people.
Yes, Harvangians, she felt, belonged where they were born. Her elders felt they had strength, wouldn't be moved easily. They even talked about demanding a separate state, if needed. If Sikhs could ask for Sikhistan, why not a fourth country for Harijans?
A fourth country. That shows real political awareness and aspiration.
It does. A sense of being overlooked by the main players, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs. They remembered leaders like Nehru promising them power. This is your country. You are the rulers. Promises that felt empty now.
What was the political context for Dalits then?
Complex. They'd had separate electorates briefly, then joint electorates with reserved seats. But crucially, in the 1946 Cabinet Mission Plan for the Constituent Assembly, they were just lumped into the general category, effectively Hindu, losing distinct political visibility compared to Muslims and Sikhs.
But they were still fighting for recognition.
Oh, yes. Harijan leaders wrote to Mountbatten demanding representation on the Boundary Commission to protect scheduled caste rights in Punjab, arguing partition based only on religion would harm them.
So they were asserting their difference, trying to navigate between Congress and the Muslim League.
Exactly. And dominant groups needed them too for votes, but also crucial labor, especially after Muslim artisans left places like East Punjab. The Butalia metal industry, for example, declined sharply.
And then, ironically, after being marginalized politically, the Indian government set up specific bodies for displaced Harijans.
Yes, like the Harijan Housing Board. A tragic irony, really.
The source also mentions Christians briefly.
Just a short anecdote from Gene Simeon. 2 Christian Air Force officers crashed and were almost killed by villagers because people couldn't grasp an identity beyond Hindu or Muslim. Both sides asked them, "What are you, Hindu or Muslim?"
Showing how deeply that binary was embedded.
Completely. And Maya Rani's story of her mother unable to hide her Muslim friend Fatima's daughters. It shows friendships existed, but community surveillance and pressure were intense. The Hindus kept a watch. If you hid anyone, they would come immediately. The breakdown of basic humanity.
Collecting these stories, especially the painful and potentially divisive ones, must have posed a huge ethical challenge.
Immense. The author writes about struggling with the tension between being honest and being careful. What if publishing bitter, one-sided accounts caused more harm? How do you handle material when you feel constrained, like having limited access to Pakistan for research?
A real burden of responsibility.
Definitely. There's a powerful interview with a villager from Thola Khalsa reflecting on the past. He remembered how Muslims used to trust Sikhs implicitly before partition.
And his view looking back.
He was brutally honest. He said Sikhs dealt with them very badly, and Muslims were right to want separation because Sikhs were not capable of living with them. He saw Sikhs suffering afterwards as a consequence, saying, "We also had some sin in us. How can humanity forgive this?"
A stark admission of collective guilt.
And chillingly, he feared history repeating. He worried about how Harijans were still treated with disrespect, denied equality, we don't give them any respect, and wondered if they might one day turn against them, mentioning leaders like Kanchi Ram. His lesson: treat everyone with respect.
Amidst all the trauma, did the source find moments of agency, especially for women survivors?
Yes, briefly, but importantly. A mention of women widowed or left alone by partition, protesting years later for better pensions. Their determination: I walked all the way from Pakistan. I'll walk here every day if I have to. And their belief in their right to demand help from the state, their my bop, shows resilience. A public assertion of their needs, contrasting with the private silences.
Claiming their voice.
Exactly. Adds another vital dimension.
So, wrapping this up, this deep dive into the other side of silence, really drives home that partition wasn't just a political event.
Not at all. It was a human earthquake, shattering lives, families, communities. These memories reveal that underside, the specific horror faced by women, the impossible choices, the trauma of children, the overlooked experiences of Dalits, Christians, and others.
These hidden histories are painful, complex, but utterly necessary for understanding partition's reality and its long shadow.
They remind us history is lived, felt, personal. It continues to shape the present, and why efforts like partition museums and archives are so important to acknowledge and preserve these human stories.
We've heard today about terrible hardship, agonizing choices, unexpected cruelty, but also moments of kindness and incredible resilience. It leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
How do societies truly reckon with histories like this? Histories of such deep violence and division, often within communities, not just between them. And what does acknowledging these complex, painful truths actually mean for trying to build bridges and understanding across those borders, old and new today?
It's a question that hangs heavy long after the events themselves.
It certainly does. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.